Mic, so now we have the mic on. Poor grandma didn't get to hear any of Mike's stuff. Oh dear. Yeah, we'll know about it soon enough. Well, last week we studied Luke chapter 12, verse 21. Just one verse. So is he who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. Now, there are two summary statements by Jesus in this paragraph. First is the introductory statement, when he tells the disciples to be wary of covetousness. Now, that statement is found in Luke 12:15. For one's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions. Then Jesus ends the parable with a summary of the foolishness of a covetous man. So is the one who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. So taken together, you can see the negative version and the implied positive version that the fool has missed. We're learning about the difference in treasures. There are temporal treasures, there are eternal treasures. The fool's treasures are temporary because possessions cannot be kept beyond death. On the other hand, we're told that there are some treasures that are riches with God. So what is treasure? Most common answer is the treasure is valuable commodities like gold and silver or precious gems. And treasures are not evil. God sometimes promises great blessings on his people. And if God gives you something, then obviously it's not evil. The problem is when a person comes to rely upon his wealth and forgets God and loves neither God nor his neighbor, he only loves his or her treasures. We looked at Deuteronomy 8, verses 11 through 14. Beware that you do not forget the Lord your God by not keeping his commandments, his judgments, and his statutes, which I command you today, lest when you have eaten and are full, and have built beautiful houses and dwell in them, and when your herds and your flocks multiply, and your silver and your gold multiply, and all that you have multiplies, then your heart is lifted up, and you forget the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. So the danger of treasures is that they will corrupt you, and they corrupt you by causing you to forget God. Physical treasures are dangerous because they distract you from the spiritual life. When you're enamored with lovely trinkets on earth, you're not thinking about heavenly matters. So then, what use are physical treasures, if any? Are they just useless? Certainly not. God often blesses us with treasures for good reasons. One reason God may give you surplus is found in 2 Corinthians 9, verses 6 through 11. Now, in the Old Testament, the tithe was just the 10% minimum of your gift to the church to be used for basic ministry. But above that, there were gifts to the poor and funding of special ministries. Paul says in 2 Corinthians chapter 9 that it's wonderful that the Corinthians have donated money to the poor churches who are suffering around the region. Paul tells them God has blessed you so that you can bless others. The promise of the Bible is that God's people will be a blessing to the whole earth, and liberality and generosity is one way we can do that. That's why we fund missionaries, and we are prepared for missionary or mercy ministries when they're needed. Surplus is not all meant for you. Surplus is meant also for you to be a blessing to others, because that glorifies God. Similarly, spiritual treasures exist. Gold and silver can be used as spiritual treasures when they're used for virtuous deeds. When your funds are used to help others, that generosity is a blessing to them and to yourself. However, there are spiritual treasures that have nothing at all to do with cash or commodities. Jesus warned the church at Laodicea in Revelation chapter 3 that their wealth has led them to forget God. He says, you are poor and naked and blind. What you need is pure, refined gold, and that only comes from God. And you need pure white garments. That only comes from Jesus. And a remedy for blindness, which also comes from God. They lacked purity and wisdom. They needed salvation. They needed white robes. That's symbolic of being purified by Jesus. So salvation and wisdom are just two examples of spiritual treasures. It is a mistake to believe that your security or happiness is based on your possessions. Barns full of expensive commodities cannot bring you salvation or even happiness. Stocks and bonds and gold and silver are the treasures of fools. Now, at best, Earthly wealth is only a tool to use for spiritual goods, for generosity and for building and repairing and restoring people, also for protecting and feeding and caring for people. Your wealth is not your own. All of your possessions and money belong to God, and you're supposed to use it, like the Corinthians, to do good deeds that glorify Jesus. So turn over now to 2 Corinthians chapter 4. We'll read 2 Corinthians 4:17 through 5:1. 2 Corinthians 4:17 through 5:1. For our light affliction, which is but for a moment, is working for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory, while we do not look at things which are seen, but at things which are not seen. For the things that are seen are temporary, but the things that are not seen are eternal. For we know that if our earthly house, this tent, is destroyed, we have a building from God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. So what we think of as treasure now, gold and silver and donuts, will not be of any use in the New Jerusalem. Those walls will have precious gems and the streets are paved with gold, but they no longer have any economic value. They're just decorations. Some of your friends and your relatives and your ancestors and your descendants will be there. And Jesus Christ, your Savior, will be there. They will be your greatest treasures. The treasures in the future will be emotional and spiritual. They will give joy and happiness based on the promises of God and the work of Jesus as eternal. So that ends the review. That's what we talked about last week. Today we're taking 3 verses, Luke chapter 12, verses 22 through 24. So I'll read you those verses, Luke 12, 22 to 24. Then he said to his disciples, "Therefore I say to you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat, nor about the body, what you will put on. Life is more than food, and the body is more than clothing. Consider the ravens, for they neither sow nor reap, they have neither storehouse nor barn, but God feeds them. Of how much more value are you than the birds?" Although Jesus is still speaking on the same topic, about learning to value spiritual things, not just spiritual things, material things, he's now shifting to a less extreme version of the sin of covetousness. He started by talking about extreme materialists, atheists, people who know nothing but what they can see and taste and feel. They ignore the invisible things and they're doomed for their obliviousness. There are even a lot of unbelievers who might agree with Jesus on that topic to some degree. For political or selfish reasons, they might hate the rich, and they recognize there's more to life than money and power. In their consciences, perhaps, they sense the folly of materialism, but that doesn't make them Christians. They fancy themselves wiser and shrewder than the dense rich cousins, and they believe by supporting various liberal causes or promoting this or that political reform, God will accept them. Whoever God is, he must like generosity and kindness. So if I act generously or kindly, God will save me, even though I don't know who he is or what he means. But they think then that being better than their neighbors, they will earn the afterlife. But that's no more use than materialism. A vague sense of spirituality or earning your way into God's grace is not saving faith. A much larger change of heart is required in a human soul for it to be saved. Similarly, we Christians may be fooled into believing that because we're not so materialistic as the rich man and his barns, we're not at all covetousness or trapped in loving the things of the world. But I want you to see that Jesus just started with the lowest hanging fruit, so to speak. He only brought up the most obvious idiocy to start his critique of covetousness, of loving the world rather than God. Now Jesus turns to the more mundane, obvious, constant, daily walk of life, in which we prove to be even more covetousness than we think we are. In this paragraph, Jesus will discuss 2 normal daily subjects and show that we are still largely creatures of the world even after we've been converted. And his 2 topics in this paragraph are food and clothing. We'll do clothing next week. This week is food. It's much easier for us to talk about gold and silver and stocks and bonds and all those fools who are addicted to them, because those are the other guys. Those are those rich guys. We're not like that. We're not rich, so we can't be covetous. I don't have any gold or silver or stocks or bonds. My retirement account is almost zero, so I can tell myself that I'm innocent of the dangers of wealth. But Jesus tells his disciples that this is wrong thinking. Poor people are less obviously materialistic because we have little. But what little we have, we adore and cherish. And we do everything we can to protect what little we have. And that's just materialism at the normal level, not the wealthy level. You see, there are more poor people in hell than there are rich people, simply because there are more poor people than there are rich people. That's the only reason there's a difference. Both kinds are lost because they ignored Jesus Christ, not because of the amount of evil they were capable of doing. A rich man has more ability to do evil because he can afford it. A poor man can't afford all that much evil. However, he would if he could, and he does the best he can to revel in his own pleasures just as much as a rich guy would with his. The first things that Jesus said about food in Luke 12, verses 22 to 23 are these. I'm clipping them out I'm leaving out the clothing stuff. I'm just leaving in the food part. Do not worry about your life, what you will eat. Life is more than food. So Jesus tells us not to worry about what we will eat because life is more than food. Now, all of us can probably nod in agreement with that. Yeah, sure, life is more than food. It seems rather obvious. And yet, are you completely blind to the fact that we don't live as if this is true? I suspect that everyone in this room is blinded because we're all slaves of our cultural norms. We are all members of a rich society. And it has made the lust of the flesh one of its key requirements for membership. You grow up steeped in the love of the eyes, the love of the flesh, and the lustful pride of life. We're taught from birth to seek things that satisfy us the most. And those things that supposedly satisfy us are those we learn from advertising in our consumer culture. You know, most people in the world don't have constant advertising. When I was in Africa, the only advertising was the occasional billboard. There just isn't any. So in other words, we are very little more than trained seals. We bark when we are told to bark, and we clap when we should clap, because we eat what our culture tells us to eat, and we eat it until we are stuffed and fat, and all the while we tell ourselves we are not materialists. We're lying to ourselves. We are all materialists. But this is nothing specially exclusive to the United States. It's the same sin that's been going on since the fall of man. The work of the devil is to corrupt what is good. Food is good. To corrupt food is to tempt us to eat too much, too little, or to eat it in sinful ways. It's the extremes in which the devil usually tempts us, because food is a wonderful good thing when it's used rightly, and it's a nasty, ungodly thing when it is used wrongly. I want you to notice that food is the third thing that God said to Adam and Eve. First, God told them who they were, then he told them what they were supposed to do, and then he told them to eat. That's the third thing God told man. Genesis 1:29. God said, "See, I have given you every herb that yields seed, which is on the face of all the earth, and every tree which fruit yields seed. To you it shall be for food." Food is important because we require it. We need it. Our bodies need it to survive. Food is the fuel of the human body. Like a car running out of gas, your body comes to a stop if you have no calories to burn in your engine. God created us that way. Even before sin, Adam and Eve were dependent on a supply of food, and God gave them a plentiful supply of herbs and plants. The very first sin on earth was related to food. The great dragon Satan planted the thought in Eve that God was not good because he didn't give her all the food. God stopped you from eating this tree. This is the best tree. The rest of the trees are nonsense. If you ate that tree, you'd be like God. So the very first sin was the devil talking Eve into eating it. And then she talked Adam into eating it. And all humanity became selfish and slaves to Satan ever since. After the flood, God changed the food rules to allow us to eat meat with some limitations. They were to drain out all the blood because blood is the symbol of life and it should not be eaten. But later in the law of Moses, food rules became even stricter and more detailed because God wanted people, the Jews, to show their loyalty to him by being different from all the countries around them. So he gave them all kinds of strange rules just so they would be different and holy. But God also gave them times of privation and hunger to teach them lessons. So turn over to Deuteronomy chapter 8. We're going to look at verses 2 and 3. Deuteronomy 8, verses 2 and 3. And you shall remember that the Lord your God led you all the way these 40 years in the wilderness, to humble you and to test you, to know what was in your heart, whether you would keep his commands or not. So he humbled you, he allowed you to hunger, and he fed you with manna, which you did not know, nor did your fathers know, that he might make you know that man shall not live by bread alone, but man lives by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. So the disobedient people wandered in the desert as a lesson for unfaithfulness, and God humbled them with hunger, yet fed them with manna to remind them where their bread was buttered, so to speak. Stop biting the hand that feeds you, might be the more apt saying. When Jesus hungered during his 40-day fast, Satan suggested that he could make his own food. And Jesus' reply came from Deuteronomy 8:3. Man shall not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God. There was a safety net for the poor and the hungry among the Jews, aside from simply getting help from the community directly. Turn over to Leviticus chapter 19. It's right before Deuteronomy and Numbers. Leviticus 19, verses 8 and 9. When you reap the harvest of your crops, you shall not wholly reap the corners of the field, nor shall you gather the gleanings from your harvest. And you shall not glean your vineyard, nor shall you gather every grape from your vineyard. You shall leave some for the poor and the stranger. I am the Lord your God. This enabled the poor and the hungry to get some food without having to ask for handouts like beggars. They worked a little, just like the harvesters and the owners, to get some of the bread or the grapes. This was an honorable way to eat, just as the story of Ruth showed in the book of Ruth. Now, the sin that you hear most often regarding food is called gluttony. It comes from the Latin word meaning to gulp. So in other words, if you think of yourself chugging down a Gatorade or chugging down a glass of water, think of yourself gulping down food. That's what gluttony is from, gulping down food. Now, Thomas Aquinas broke down gluttony into 5 separate types of food sins. I'm not sure that I agree with this, but certainly these are all kinds or types. So, number 1, eating food that is too expensive, causing you to waste your money. I mean, like living on caviar all the time. That'd be pretty stupid. Number 2, eating food that and wastes time. I mean, if it takes you 12 hours to make dinner, maybe you shouldn't make dinner that takes 12 hours. 3, eating too much food. That's the one we normally think of. Number 4, eating at inappropriate times or too often. And number 5, eating greedily, too quickly and without appreciation. The first 3 kinds are the types of foods, and the last 2 are the ways you eat them. And he says that the cure for these kinds of sins is fasting. Periodic fasting causes you to become unaddicted to foods. Now, one example from gluttony comes from Deuteronomy 21:20, where the parents tell the elders of the country, we have a stubborn and rebellious son, a glutton and a drunkard. And if the elders in a find this to be true, the son was stoned to death. Gluttony is there paired with drunkenness. They're both very similar sins. One is having too much food, and one is having too much alcohol. Both are called idolatry. This is even said in the New Testament. Philippians chapter 3. And you can stay in Philippians. We'll come back to Philippians here in several minutes. Philippians 3, verses 18 through 19. For many walk, of whom I have told you often, whose end is destruction, whose God is their belly, and whose glory set their mind on earthly things. You see, setting your mind on earthly things means your end is destruction, your God is your belly, and your glory is your shame. That's looking at earthly things as your God. A glutton has as his or her God his or her belly. And that's what Jesus is saying. How is he saying it? It's not just when you overeat, it's when you worry about food. Luke 24, I'll read that to you again. This is one obvious truth from Jesus about food. Consider the ravens, for they neither sow nor reap. They have neither storehouse nor barn, yet God feeds them. Of how much more value are you than the birds? So Jesus, God values you more than he values birds. God values birds. So if you worry about food, you don't trust God. You don't really believe that God loves you, values you, or intends to care for you. Now, on the news and in real life, we often see stories or hear them about children who have been neglected or starved by their own parents. And we instinctively despise such people because they're careless caretakers. And we hope to find better homes for those children. When you worry about your food, you're really telling everyone around you that your God is either incapable or unwilling to care for you. Our God is not helpless or stupid or mean. Who on earth would want to worship and love a God like that? And if you complain to other people about your fears, they learn only that your God is not good, not worth serving. That's worse than idolatry. That's blasphemy and slander. That is exactly what Satan accused God of in Genesis 3 and in Job 1. In Genesis 3, Lucifer told Eve, God is not good, but because he's keeping good food from you. He just lets you eat the scraps out of the garden. What kind of a God is that? And then in the book of Job, Satan told God to his face, you're not lovable. Job only serves you because you make him rich and give him all the food he wants. If you took away the food and took away his riches, he wouldn't love you anymore. You're unlovable, God. That is what the devil believes, and that's what he wants you to believe. They are both slanders. And those are the kind of slanders you commit when you worry about your food. It means you have a wrong view of the character and goodness of God. And that is just one aspect of fearing that you will starve. Now, that is a rather irrational fear, at least in our country. People in the United States very rarely starve. They may be malnourished because they don't get a good balanced nutritionist diet. Junk food is cheaper than good food, so many poor people eat lots of junk. But the truth is, when most of us say, I'm starving, it is a lie. You're not starving. It means you're hungry. And being hungry is supposed to happen. It's what your body does when you are running low on fuel. It says, give me more fuel. The expectation that you should never be hungry is silly. And of course, it's also true that your stomach grows when you eat a lot, and it gets harder and harder to feel full the fatter and fatter you get. So the more you overeat, the more you need to overeat to fill the larger stomach. Now, I'm not making any suggestion that looking large or that being fat is a sin. Our culture constantly redefines its view of what beautiful is and what ugly is. I was amazed in an article I read last year. It showed photos of what were considered to be sexy body shapes for women over the last 120 years, decade by decade. 100 years ago, you were supposed to be plump. That was the sexy look. But then 10 or 20 years later, skinny. And then 10 or 20 years later, curvy. And 10 or 20 years later, flat and barren. So every decade, it's just a cultural change that magazines promote this look versus that look. The fact is that God makes bodies of various sizes and shapes, and that any attempt you make to enlarge or shrink parts of your body may succeed or fail, but it's not critical to who you are. We're talking about how you view and interact with food, a basic human need. We're not talking about how it affects you so much today. The way that food is supposed to affect you is to give you strength to live and to do your duties well. That's the purpose of food, is to keep you alive and make you able to work. There was a famous ancient orator, Roman, named Cicero. And this is a great statement. You should eat to live, not live to eat. That's perfect. Eat to live rather than live to eat. There's also an ancient Egyptian proverb they found in some kind of an ancient pyramid or a temple or something. Here's what it says. 1/4 of what you eat keeps you alive. The other 3/4 keeps your doctor alive. An ancient Egyptian proverb. That's pretty good. When I looked for some reasons why people may overeat, I found two useful ideas. One was an article on Christianity.com talking about gluttony. And here's a quote from that article. A lot of gluttony is born from boredom. Life is not satisfying or stimulating. Relationships feel empty. Work is boring, but food is always there and tastes good. And so you become addicted to food because the rest of your life is boring. So a lot of it, you're eating is just out of boredom. And then there was a 2016 article in Psychology Today magazine. They did some experiments watching people snack. And they discovered that if you're eating a meal and you're focused on it with no big distractions, you're just eating, your body tells you when to stop and you quit eating because you feel full. However, if you're eating while you're watching television or playing video games or doing other distracting things, your body never senses that you're full and it keeps on eating. You're too distracted to know that you're full. And so you just keep snacking. And that's where a majority of our extra calories come from. So basically, your unconscious mind is eating and your body doesn't notice or care because your brain is too full of nonsense to notice. Now, there's other kind of food sins also, aside from just eating too much. C.S. Lewis has a really interesting one that I've never run into before in the Screwtape Letters. You remember, this is a book about demons discussing how to tempt people. This is one quote, a paragraph to show you what I mean. One demon writing to another. Your patient's mother, as I learned from her dossier, and you might have learned from Glubose, is a good example. She would be astonished, one day I hope she will be, to learn that her whole life is enslaved to sensuality. And it is quite hidden from her by the fact that the quantities involved are so small. But what do quantities matter if you can use a human belly and palate to produce querulousness, impatience, uncharitableness, and self-concern? Glubose has this old woman well in hand. She is a positive terror to waiters and servants. She's always turning away from what is offered to her, and she says with a demure little smile and sigh, please, please, all I want is a cup of tea, weak but not too weak, and the teensy weeniest bit of really crisp toast. You see, because what she wants is smaller and less costly than other people, she never recognizes as gluttony her sin to get what she wants, however troublesome it may be to others. At the very moment of indulging her appetites, she believes she's practicing temperance. In a crowded restaurant, she gives a little scream at the plate, which some overworked waitress sets before her and says, oh, that's far, far too much. Take it away and bring me about a quarter of it. And if challenged, she would say she's doing this to avoid waste. In reality, she does it because the particular shade of delicacy to which we have enslaved her is offended by the sight of more food than she wants. So C.S. Lewis here says that gluttony is not just eating too much. It's demanding your own way with food. You only like that food. You refuse to eat that food. You only like it this way and not the other way. You insist that you would starve before touching that. But if God has provided you with that and you don't have the other, then are you not discontent with your lot? Is God keeping you from what you want? And doesn't that mean that you are God and not God? You decide what you will eat, when you will eat it, and how you will eat it, and God has no business interfering with your divine plans? What kind of idolatry is that? Who is the Lord and God in this scenario of your life? You are God, and God is your servant. That is an idolatry of a larger kind than bowing in front of a carved totem. Gluttony is one of the chief sins because it is a daily threat. Because you must eat daily, 2 or 3 times, maybe more, it's far easier for you to get into a habit that is not glorifying to God. And once you've formed your habits, you become a slave to them until you're cured, if the grace of God does so. Here's 2 verses worth memorizing. We'll get to the Philippians one here in a second. The first one is 1 Corinthians 10:31. Therefore, whether you eat or drink, or whatever you do, do all for the glory of God. That's a pretty good basic summary statement of how you should eat, is to glorify God. But here's the other passage worth memorizing in Philippians, chapter 4, verses 11 through 13. Philippians 4, 11 through 13. Not that I speak in regard to need, for I have learned in whatever state I am to be content. I know how to be abased, and I know how to abound. Everywhere and in all things I have learned, both to be full and to be hungry, both to abound and to suffer need. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Do you notice that Jesus says you can do all things through Christ who strengthens me? And what's he talking about? Food. If he's full or if he's hungry. If we're going to define gluttony as the name of all sins regarding food, you need to stop seeing it as simply the idea of overeating, because that doesn't cover all the food sins by any stretch of the imagination. There are food sins that are done in ignorance. When we encourage animal cruelty by buying meat from factory farms, where animals are tortured and neglected, we eat unrighteously produced food. When we complain that our daily bread is insufficient or not good enough, we accuse God of being miserly and mean to us. Thus you're slandering God. When you eat ungratefully, you deny that God deserves thanks and love for what he has given you. When you don't eat enough because you live by the lusts of the pride of life and you want to look like a supermodel and be loved for your stunning body, you show your stupidity and pride in that you love people more than you love God. When you eat too much or eat unhealthy foods all day, we tell God we don't wish to care for our body, which is the temple of the Holy Spirit, and we don't care what God thinks. We love ourselves instead. And if you have super high expectations of other people, believing that they should fulfill all your picayune demands about food to prove that they love you, that's being arrogant and presumptuous before God and his people. All of these are kinds of sins, and all of them are sins against God and against people only as a distant second. Gluttony is not a victimless sin. It is a sin that will hurt you. Your body receives the consequences that arrive from bad eating. And there are also spiritual consequences on your soul. That is because no aspect of life is unimportant or neutral. You're supposed to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. That means that every action and thought should be to glorify God. So, we have intentionally and callously separated the life-sustaining act of eating from God's sight. We think of it as strictly a physical act. It has no meaning, and therefore it has no importance. That is the lie of Satan. Eating is of the highest importance. You do it to live. Therefore, how you live is of the highest importance to God. There was a USDA survey done a few years ago that the average American spends 67 minutes a day doing primary eating. That means actually eating your main meals. Then 24 more minutes eating snacks and 63 more minutes drinking sugary beverages while doing other activities. That means, as an average American, you spend 2.5 hours a day eating and drinking. Do you really believe that God doesn't care about those 2.5 hours per day? Eating is supposed to be a great blessing, and it can be if it is done rightly. God invented food. God created you to eat food. God gave us instructions on how to eat and what to eat and how to eat it. And God promised to bless his people with abundant food. And when people were hungry, Jesus made fish and bread to feed them. The purpose of food is to enable us to fulfill our God-given callings. If God has called you to use your spiritual gifts to help the church and to use your money to help your family and the community, then God will provide you with enough food and enough resources. Gluttons use food for their own selfish purposes, forgetting God. The key to using food rightly is to remember that food is God's gift, and use it wisely and be righteous. Let's pray. Dear Lord, help us to keep in mind the hours a day we spend eating and drinking, and help us remember to do it for your glory. It's like people who think that going to church once a week is enough, and then the rest of the week you can do whatever you want. It's the same kind of a sin, thinking that we can spend part of our day without you. Help us remember that food is important. Amen. May the Lord bless you and keep you, and make his face to shine upon you and give you peace. Amen.